Can you hear me way back there? Yeah. Okay, so we don't have a microphone, and I don't want our guest speakers to have to scream, but if you can hear, that's great. I'm Professor David Daniels, the University Writing Program. 3 of you know me, current students. And welcome to the second of 6 guest faculty lectures that have been designed in conjunction with RIT 1133. As you should know by now, one of our goals in 1133 is to introduce students to the typical kinds of research and writing that go on in university settings. Tonight's faculty lecture is on the interpretive research method, but I jotted down the dates for the upcoming panels. We've got quantitative on April 29th, qualitative on May 1st, quantitative on May 5th, and another qualitative on May 14th. So we'll begin. Thanks for bearing the snow, too. I figured nobody would show up, so I'm delighted people are here. At the heart of interpretive research is an interest in cultural artifacts or texts, by which I mean its images, its films, and its photographs, its novels, poems, short stories and plays, its news stories, and its editorials, but also its canned goods and its stuffed animals, its children's toys and video games, its advertisements and billboards, its architecture, fashion trends, medical equipment, and hygiene products, its recipes and cookbooks, which is a peculiar interest of mine, and its paintings, its sculptures, its Oprah Winfrey's, and its Britney Spears. In other words, to the interpretive scholar, all of the world is a text, or as Shakespeare famously wrote, all the world is a stage, open to interpretation and deep analysis and debate. And texts, looked at carefully, can reveal to us a particular culture's values and principles, its faith systems, or its lack of faith. We can also learn about a culture's dominant debates and attitudes. Meaning is drawn not through empirical quantitative data systems, that will happen later on, nor through experiments conducted in a carefully enclosed lab, but through the texts themselves. But apart from what interpretive researchers actually look at are also the important questions that researchers ask. Who produced this particular text? When and why? And for what intended audience? For what apparent purpose was this produced? Whose values are being supported or thwarted by such artifacts? Let me give you some examples. How do we define the term marriage? Well, the interpretive scholar would respond that that depends on which text we refer to in order to define it. And who are the authors of these texts? And what were their original purposes? And for what cultural purposes do politicians or theologians or cultural critics make reference to such texts today? Does Eminem's hip-hop lyrics constitute a form of hate speech? That depends, again, on who's looking. It depends on context, according to which audience, according to whose definition of hate. Interpretive researchers believe, I think, that knowledge is always only provisional and subjective and in flux. And that knowledge making is essentially always contingent upon contexts, plural, both upon the historical context and also upon the context of what past scholars have already been saying about a particular subject or text. In other words, knowledge and the claims we make within the humanities can never be proven as they might be within a biology lab. But is this really a limitation of the interpretive method, Or is this instead one of its greatest values? Rather than, say, close down a subject from further investigation, the researcher builds upon past knowledge and opens up new imaginative means for further conversation. And if you're an actual scholar in the research, in the humanities, you'll trust me that we just seem to keep going and going further and building upon and opening new means of talking about the same old subject. If you've ever written a dissertation, this comes in really handy, in fact. Just do years and years of research instead of writing about it. Today, we're surrounded by images and texts with 24-hour news programming, embedded journalists, personal blogs, YouTube, Facebook. We can go to tmz.com, which I do every single morning, and we can witness up-to-the-minute coverage of Amy Winehouse's latest cocaine binge, or Rob Lowe's preemptive lawsuit against his house staff before they were going to sue him the next day, which just happened a couple days ago. Not only are such images provided to us quickly, but increasingly these images are posted anonymously to the web, such as in chat rooms, which can make interpreting these texts and postings even more difficult for the humanist scholar or more exhilarating. Individually, what does each image that we get on TMZ tell us about a particular celebrity or a political candidate? And also collectively, what do all of these images reveal to us about ourselves and our own values? And also, and this is tricky, what new modes of seeing, what new modes of interpretation are available to us through these new sorts of media? Difficult questions to ponder, which I'm sure are being answered through conversation and debate in your 1133 courses. Today we have three professors who are going to speak to you about the research they do within this tradition. I'll introduce them individually, and we'll follow that up with a Q&A, where I hope people will generate some good and even very just concrete questions. Dr. Annette Stock is an art historian and the director of the School of Art and Art History at DU. She teaches classes about the history of American art, as well as a graduate research methods class. She's the author of 2 books, Holland Mania, The Unknown Dutch Period in American Art and Culture, and Pioneer Cemeteries, Sculpture Gardens of the Old West, as well as numerous articles in professional journals. And I've really talked up the graveyards and cemeteries to my students, so maybe we'll get a taste of that. Please welcome Professor Stock.
Thank you. I'm an art historian, which means that I really like to look at the world through art objects. I had a hard time with history. I always liked it, but it was so dry. And then I realized that there are great history paintings, and a single painting can encapsulate a whole era and tell you so much, not just about politics, but about how people thought about things at the time. So for me, art was a way into understanding the world. There are different types of art historians when it comes to research. I'm an object-oriented researcher. So there are art historians who are most interested in what other art historians have written, and this goes right to your point. And so they will read all those kinds of texts, and they will do research into documentation about the work of art, and then develop their writing, their research strategies around that. I'm more interested in starting with the object itself and figuring out what can that work of art tell me without anybody else interpreting it or anybody else getting in between me and the object. So if everything there is to know about a single art object, let's say a sculpture, if everything there is to know about it would take up that much, the part that the object itself can tell you is right about there. But it's the foundation. You've got to start with that. and you have to keep coming back and testing your theories against the art object, or you'll easily go astray with all of your own wonderful, marvelous interpretations that eventually the art object doesn't support you in anymore. So my area of specialization is American art, and I chose it for a specific reason. American art is a young field. There aren't lots and lots of tomes written about every single artist and every single art object in that field. So I could have worked on Mona Lisa. Right? But if I worked on Mona Lisa, I would have been reading what everybody else has said for about a century, and then I would have been condensing it, and that's of no interest to me. Instead, I wanted to work on artists in my own country that helped form my culture and my views of things, sometimes without my recognizing that that's where they came from. And to better understand why we think and speak and act the way we do through our art. So then I've chosen various topics, none of which could be said to have been a major theme in the history of art and anybody else's radar screen, but which have proved to be very fruitful for me in my quest to better understand American culture. So one of the most recent has been gravestones. In the 19th century, when people from many European countries, from Asia, from Africa, and from the United States, which was then, of course, much smaller than it is now, started moving into what we think of as the West, they were reformulating a culture, or starting a new culture. And life and death went on all the time, and so people were creating art, sometimes not thinking of it as art, and people were dying. This comes together in the cemetery, right? So if people die, they don't have to be memorialized, but it was part of every single culture that was contributing to the formation of this new culture in the West, that you do something to mark the passing of a human life. And very often, that marking took the form of something that was hoped to be fairly permanent. And these are the objects that I have been studying. So sometimes they are carved out of various stones, sometimes they were cast in metals in order to make them more permanent. Sometimes they were just wood or a pile of rocks, something that would mark that spot. And I spent quite a bit of time looking at sculpture in cemeteries, and I define sculpture pretty broadly. It's really anything that has been shaped by human hands in order to memorialize someone or mark a particular spot where the remains are. Looking at each of those objects, I would begin by searching it pretty minutely. Is there a name on it that doesn't have to do with the person who is deceased? Looking at newspaper accounts, I've found in the dental papers very often queries will be sent into the newspaper. I saw this wonderful cabin. It seemed to be like a miniature mining cabin, but it's all made out of cement. What's up with this thing? Will be the question. And then the answer from the newspaper will be some researcher who only had 10 minutes to find out, puts together something that they were able to sort of say, well, at least this much is true. And so the answer that comes back is, well, we think that that was made around such and such a time, and here's the person it memorializes. This is everything about that person's life. And there will be nothing about the object. And there will be nothing about who made the object, or why it was chosen, and why it's there. And those are all the questions that I'm interested in. So, for example, there is a life-size marble horse in Riverside Cemetery, which is just north of Denver. It was established in 1876 as a cemetery. And that horse has been in the newspaper as a query like this at least 7 times in the last century. And none of those times did anybody look at that horse, because the first time I looked at it, there's this huge horse, and there it is in big letters, James A. Byrne, SC, sculptor. So the first place to look is at the object. It tells you a lot. Its style, what materials, where those materials came from, might tell you where it was originally manufactured. All of that information can be brought together as a basis. Then then the next step for me is to go beyond the object to start researching it in newspapers, in archives, in individuals' personal papers that have been preserved. What can I find out about the person who made it and the person it memorializes? And then how can I start answering those questions that I have? The questions determine my research strategy. If I want to know why was this particular image was chosen for this particular person who's buried here, then I need a strategy to figure that out. Well, I have to know everything I can about the person. I have to figure out everything I can about that object within the culture. How do they fit together? And if I can find someone who's actually written a statement like, well, I decided to buy Uncle George a sculpture that shows a baby in a seashell, which was actually a fairly popular kind of memorial. And the reason I did so was because he had this traumatic event in his childhood. And that is so wonderful. That's a researcher's dream. Please give me that. I have yet to find a single piece of paper, and I have read a lot of primary documentation that tells me why anybody chose any tombstone. Period. I haven't found it. So I'm still searching for my needle in the straw. But the search is interesting. My research is very much like being a detective. That's how I think of it. I've got a problem, I need to find answers. I'm using some of the same databases as a detective would because I'm trying to track down people. I'm looking for Social Security sometimes. I'm looking for their military records. I'm looking for just basic things. Because all of us as we go through life, we need a trail. If you think about your own life, there's just a huge paper record. You've left a huge trail. From your birth certificate on, you'd be surprised how much of that stuff is going to stick around for the next 150 years at least. So the 19th century is a nice time to work on because there is really a lot of it, surprisingly, to find. So with my tombstones, I went throughout a 5-state area in the Rocky Mountains, looking only at 19th century cemeteries, surveying the tombstones, sometimes actually doing some quantitative work, figuring out exactly how many and what type there is to see if that told me anything, what patterns emerge from my research. And finding out as much as I could about the people who were there, but especially about the signatures on those tombstones. Who made it? What was the history of their making? And usually the name isn't who made it. Almost never. You find this nice little maker's name somewhere on the tombstone, and you start researching it. Pretty soon you find out M. Rao, the name on about 20 tombstones in Riverside, isn't a person that you can track down. It's a business name. M. Rao Marble, who hired a whole bunch of sculptors whose names aren't recorded anywhere. So it becomes a much bigger project to try and find out information about the sculptor and why they created it the way they did, and so on. Once I had gathered all that information and started to sort out patterns and figure out what was going on, I needed to do that most difficult stage in research, where you want to make the transition into writing, and in between you've got to do a lot of thinking. It's really all about thinking. What have I got to say about this? I don't think anybody in my audience is going to be interested in a catalog of absolutely everything that I found, because there's a lot. How do I distill this down to something that really does say something new, something different? My job is to create knowledge. So what is that knowledge going to be? How do I do that? And it's a tough problem. Sometimes, as with my first big research project was my master's thesis. And it was about paintings by one artist. That ought to be easy enough. It's nice and limited. But he had painted a whole bunch of portraits of women that were just bizarre. And nobody could figure them out. And so I had them all laid out in Xeroxes. That was my research, way too much data. What was I going to do with it? And looking at it for patterns, I started to get ideas. Whenever I came up against a wall, I would just turn it all upside down. Well, let's not start with these assumptions. Let's think of different assumptions. Maybe that will lead me to my major point, my contribution. So I also did this with the tombstones to come up with what is it that I'm going to say. And with that, I finally came to realize that the interesting thing about these cemeteries to me is that in the West, where society was establishing itself in a kind of Euro-American model, but not at all exclusively, with large populations of African Americans, Asian Americans, and many others, cemeteries were the very first place where there was public art. It was the center of public sculpture. It was like a sculpture garden. And it was used intentionally by people who were developers and investors in these early towns to lure people to them. They would say, just as Denver says to a potential business, we've got a great art museum, we've got 3 art museums, you should come here. Towns used to say, we have this amazing cemetery. You've got to come here and see it. We've got some of the best art around. We're not the Wild West. We're safe and cultured, and so that I realized was really the point that I wanted to make about this. And who were the makers and who were the people who bought it and why they placed it where they were all the sort of supporting blocks for that argument. So I had a lot of fun with that project. And I haven't quite figured out entirely what my next project is, but I know my method will be very similar. I'll go into the research, I'll choose a topic where there's little written, because I want to be the first one to sort of figure it out, and I'll pull together all my information, look for patterns, find what my point is, what is my particular perspective contribution going to be on this, and then begin writing it once I've got it all thought through. So I hope that's helpful.
Thank you. That's great. Thank you. I had a conversation with Rachel today about hairspray. She's writing an analysis of hairspray. And we were negotiating. Find out about the first hairspray. What do people say about it? But then go back to the movie. Look at the text itself, the artifact itself. That's a really important point you make. Thank you. Our next speaker, Professor Luc Baudouin. His research interests include gender, gay issues in Russian poetry and culture, literary psychoanalysis and Lacan, cultural semiotics, romantic irony, and idealism in its Russian manifestations. He's currently working on a book examining the construction of masculinity in Russian culture today, and has also begun working on similar aspects in Brazilian culture, comparing the Brazilian and Russian experiences. Please welcome Professor Baudouin.
I've been told that I don't know, actually I'd probably be claiming right now, but I've been told that I speak in a low, soft voice, so if I start speaking more soft. When I was a graduate student, my work was actually on Russian poetry of the 19th century, and that was what my dissertation was on. And partially that's because at the time in the 1980s, early 1990s, what I really wanted to do was to do something, I guess, shocking to the then Soviet community and make them scared, and I was told I shouldn't. So I decided that I would work on something safe and just sort of hone my skills. After the Soviet Union dissolved, I was free to do whatever I wanted, and I started working more on images of masculinity in Russian culture today. The reason why this interests me is because it's a somewhat untouched field. It's the Soviet Union itself. If you're talking about, what I mean by masculinity, by the way, I mean a sexualization of the masculine image in Russian culture, in literature, in film, in advertisements, in magazines, and so on. This wasn't talked about in the Soviet Union. This is a true story, but it shows the attitude towards sex in the Soviet Union and why I want to work on this topic. In the mid-1980s, I think it was 1988, there used to be a show with Phil Donahue, who most of you probably would know, who did a talk show, and they would do television bridges with Soviet audiences, and they would do them live, and they would ask each other questions. And there's a famous incident which I watched, I saw it live on TV, of a woman in Massachusetts who stood up and asked a question of a Soviet audience in then Leningrad, now St. Petersburg. asking what do they do about the problems of premarital sex, abortion, and homosexuality in the Soviet Union. And on the Soviet side, this woman stood up. She looked very impressive, probably a general or a general's wife, medals down her chest, blonde hair up to here in a bun, looked really indignant, really angry, and said, "We have no sex in the Soviet Union." This is one reason why I want to work on this topic. So what am I actually looking for? What I'm looking for is, as I said, a sexualization of the male body. In particular because in the Soviet Union, no one talked about sex. In Russia, after the demise of the Soviet Union, images of masculinity disappeared. There has been writing about this. People have written magazine articles, books, academic books, popular books, that the demise of the empire meant that men felt demasculinized and that they had lost control over their own country. And the placement of capitalism, and it was wild capitalism in the 1990s, meant as well that men felt that they had no control over what they were able to do. Simultaneously, what's going on in the literature spheres and in art and film in general is the controls that the Soviet Union had, which were pretty strict about what type of literary production could be produced, past censors and so on. Those were lifted. And most writers and filmmakers were free to do whatever they wanted. So you have some very famous writers who were writing books that, for example, one of them, where characters in the book, Khrushchev, one of the major leaders in the 1960s, the Soviet Union, and Stalin are in fact lovers, and they have sex in the book. It's pretty graphic, actually. And Hitler has won the war, and this goes on and on and on, this mixture of sex and actually violence. And that's the type of literature that's being produced. So Russian men, in particular images of men, their self-image, they're being fed these books. It doesn't really help the image of masculinity. And that book, by the way, it's called Blue Lard, and it's by a writer named Vladimir Sorokin. It was one of the books, he was one of the writers as a result of the book, charged with obscenity in Russia fairly recently. And the charges were dismissed, but it shows that Russian society, even while all this is going on, was not open to the idea of considering these images. So as well, just as an aside, I went to Russia a year and a half ago. I'll be back there in June to do research, and we'll talk about how I do that in a second. But Russian Newsweek found out that I was there, and they tracked me down, this woman, very nice woman, and she interviewed me about what I was doing, and after I talked to her, she was smoking her cigarette, and I can't do a good Russian woman smoking a cigarette. She blew the smoke in my face, and she said, "We can't publish this." And I said, "Why not?" She said, "Russia is not ready to hear what you're doing." And that was that. It's still not been published. They still have it, and very someday they'll use it, but they contact me on a regular basis to get my opinion on stuff, and then tell me they can't use it. What I'm looking at in sources then, I'm looking at literature, and the volume of literature being produced in Russia is enormous now. And all I do, I go online and I order stacks and stacks of books, which our library can't get, which you can't easily find. I order magazines. I order fashion magazines that are targeted towards men. I order gay magazines that are targeted towards men as well. I order any sort of magazine, even popular culture magazines that they have in Moscow weekly that tells them what's going on culturally. I order those. I look at the images, I look at the stories, the texts that are written, trying to decode how masculine pastimes and the sense of masculinity is embedded in those magazines and in those books. I order detective novels. Detective novels are hugely popular in Russia today, and one of the most popular series has a gay character who is the lead detective, and this person is using his contacts to solve these crimes. This interests me because there's, at the same time as this is going on, and people are reading these novels, there is, for example, other things that I look at, art. There was an art exhibit in Moscow and in Paris, where one of the most popular photos was of two Russian policemen necking in the woods, and they were just kissing. This caused the art exhibit to be banned. It was banned in Moscow, and in Paris, the art gallery got threats from the Russian community and the Russian Orthodox Church, threatened to boycott, and there were all sorts of messy things that occurred. So that's going on while simultaneously the detective novel has this gay character who's solving all these problems. So I'm trying to get as much material as I can so that I can sort through it. And I am trying to look at the reason, I should back up. The reason why the Russian Newsweek woman didn't want to publish it is that I am looking at Russian masculinity as represented as a sexual object, self-represented as a sexual object. How Russian men went from, in the Soviet Union, being the masters of the universe, to, which has its own sexuality, if you like, to the demise of the Soviet Union where they felt powerless. And then sort of cascading to the 1990s, where the typical image of Russian masculinity as presented is the mafioso guy, big neck, buzz hair, driving a black Jeep Cherokee, who grabs his women as he goes by and solves problems by killing people. There's film after film that does this. And that today, this masculinity is self-questioning enough and self-realizing enough that sexualized images of masculinity are threatening. To put this even more in context, Russian men have traditionally held hands in public. There was nothing, no one would ever think anything of this. It was just a gesture of friendship. After the Soviet Union dissolved and more ideas of gay rights came into Russia, you'd be hard-pressed to find any Russian man holding another man's hand now. It would be impossible. It's changed that fast, but no one talks about it. So I'm trying to put that context in as well. So as you can tell, it's huge. I'm looking at it at different angles, and the book is progressing, but it's somewhat difficult. As for the writing, I'm processing the information, trying to write the chapters by themes. A man named Igor Khan, who is a preeminent sexologist in Moscow, beat me to it, actually. He published a book about this thick, this big, about images of masculinity in Russian culture. Beautiful book. It cost about $100, and I ordered it. And luckily, though, it's just a catalog of imagery. It doesn't do what I'm trying to do. So I can use his book as a source for mine and continue to build on it. As David said, I can build on it, interpret it differently. And mine is, as I've also said, quite different. I think the other last thing that frames the research that I'm doing and how I'm approaching it is the idea of homosexuality, male homosexuality specifically, as something from the outside. In the Soviet Union, there was a law against male homosexuality specifically, not against lesbianism. And that law was enforced, and it meant that men who were gay or suspected of being gay would be sent to concentration camps, and usually they would die when they were there. That law was repealed in the early 1990s, but the reason why the law was in place in the first instance was because male homosexuality was viewed as a corrupt thing that existed only because of capitalism. And that's how the law was promulgated, and that's why it was put into place. It disappeared not because the Russian government had a sudden change of heart, but because when Yeltsin was fighting against the attempted coup, that when Gorbachev, at the very end of the Soviet Union, he was holed up in the south, and there was an attempted coup by hardliners to make the Soviet government in its dying days extra hardline. Yeltsin was fighting this coup, and he was standing on top of a tank, and he was talking to the crowds in Moscow. The only reason why he was able to get information from one place to another was because the little gay magazine, which no longer exists, was the only one that had working fax machines. And people used those fax machines to keep it in the press. As a result, the sodomy law, basically, which is what it was, the law against male homosexuality, was repealed. And it's not been put back in place, although there are some discussions to put it back in place. That, however, doesn't mean that Russians today, the average Russian, views homosexuality as something that maybe his son or daughter might do. It's still viewed as something totally from the outside, something that only comes from the West. There are no movies that have openly gay themes. There's one called You I Love, and it was released a few years ago. Some of my students have seen it. And it shows the gay character in that film comes from Central Asia, is not Russian, and it's very mystical. And so the whole thing is not at all sexualized, but rather a mystical experience that shatters a relationship. And that context still exists, and I'm trying to do, I guess I'm winding up, I'm doing my research because I have this passion, I have this idea that I want Russians the average Russian to see that no, it's not something totally different. In fact, it's part of Russian culture, and it's been a dance with Russian culture from outside to inside, from the West to what the Russian soul is supposed to be, and it's represented all around them in some way or another. So I hope that helps a little bit. I sort of ramble when I talk. Thanks very much.
Thank you, Luke. I'm going to emphasize a point that might be tricky, but it's important for my students, and I know it's important for Professor Sands' students. It's this issue of a critical framework. You used the word frame. How am I framing my inquiry? And you talk about outsidership and issues of sexuality. There's a difference between just watching Hairspray over and over again, Rachel, and watching it with some critical lens on, or where you're looking for something particular, in particular. That is a difficult shift in 1133, to just have the object I'm interested in and then actually look for something. So you illustrated that really well. I appreciate that. Professor John Tiedemann is our last speaker tonight. His scholarly interests include rhetorical theory, literary theory, and American literature. His dissertation examines the ways in which American writers of the 1960s looked to political innovations such as those embodied in the civil rights movement, the rise of the new right, and the rise and decline of the imperial presidency for models whereby to imagine the act of literary innovation. Please welcome John.
I realize now it's been a while since I've been in a lecture hall where I've had to project like this. But so, as Luke was saying, if my voice goes down a little bit, that means I'm lying or making something up. Ask you to be louder. You're just best to ignore that portion of the discourse. A couple of the things that I'll pick up on are, I think, areas of overlap between what the previous two speakers have discussed. But I'll try to take a slightly different angle on it, and also see if I can take some of these ideas and maybe put them in a context that I'm familiar with as a teacher of Writ 1122 and 1133. Think about what this, how we can kind of transition, I guess, the discussion a little bit by thinking in sort of those terms. But if I were to try to sum up what I do as somebody who interprets things, I would say that, sort of a funny thing to say about yourself, right? But regardless of what it is that I'm looking at, or the approach that I might be taking to that particular object, whether it's a verbal artifact or a visual artifact, or sometimes even a musical artifact, what I'm trying to do in all cases is to make something familiar strange. I think if that's the sort of common thread is that, trying to take something familiar and to make it strange in some way. And to make it, indeed, as strange as I can. To make it strange enough that it starts to affect other things that I thought were familiar and start to look strange, even though I would never have thought that these two, to sort of connect this object to this other thing. So that idea of moving from the familiar to the strange is just a common thread, regardless of the artifact I'm examining. So I'll give you an example of an effort to do this. And then I'll sort of talk a little bit about what I think, what were the principles and the thought processes, the motivations that kind of affected this itinerary. And then try to again, recontextualize and think about it in terms of a written class, for example. So something that I wrote a little while back, not too long ago, was an interpretation of a text that if you are an English major or go on to be an English major, or God forbid, go to graduate school for English studies, you sort of can't avoid no matter how hard you might try. And it's an essay by a very famous American pseudo-British poet named T.S. Eliot. It's called Tradition and the Individual Talent. It's about as moldy a piece of literary criticism as you can imagine. Just a sort of a monument, but a decayed monument. It turned to dust. It's been read and reread so many times, and is in some ways moldering because it's so foundational. The ideas that are in this essay and the other essays that Eliot wrote in this period sort of informed thought about literature and literary criticism in ways that became very, very standard And thus the things that become standard then become old hat eventually. And by the time I found it, again, it's got the oldest hat in the habit. So this essay, as I say, absolutely standard essay, nothing strange, utterly familiar if you're a student of literature, literary criticism, even if you've never read the thing before, you come to it and it's a set of familiar ideas. And so looking at this, I think, what is it about this that's just weird? What is it in this object that I know before I even meet that I just can't account for? I'm looking for sort of the loose thread, something that just doesn't fit, that bugs me in some way. It just seems odd or quirky. And it occurred to me that here we've got a title of an essay that has sort of two key terms, nothing fancy about the title, tradition and the individual talent. Talks quite a bit about tradition throughout the essay. The word tradition occurs again and again and again and again. But I noticed the word talent doesn't actually appear anywhere. I think that's odd, right? That you would call your title, you would put in your title what appear to be the two key terms of the title. One of them clearly cashes out as a key term. The other, although he's talking about poetry, he's talking about artists, he's talking about all kinds of people who are using all kinds of words that we might imagine as sort of synonyms for talent. Word talent itself doesn't appear. I think this is very strange. So I do what people who study literature do. I immediately go to the Oxford English Dictionary. It's your first step, no matter what. If you don't know how to, you're locked out of your car, you go to the Oxford English Dictionary. So I go to the Oxford English Dictionary and sort of look at just where did this word come from? How did it enter the English language? What's its etymology? What's its sort of history as a word? What kinds of various meanings have accrued to it over time? And I discovered that the word talent entered the English language via the Greek, okay, by way of what's called the parable of the talents, which you may be familiar with. It's a rather well-known parable from the New Testament of the Bible. Well, that's very interesting. What the word talent originally meant in Greek was sort of a unit of money, it'd be like saying $1 or a pound or something like this. That way back when Greeks measured their money in terms of talents. This is what the parable is about. The parable is about this rich guy who's going out of town. He gives portions of money to his servants to see what they're going to do with the money. Two of them do the right thing, one of them does the wrong thing. It's a parable. It's a moral to be drawn from this economic metaphor, right? But what happens is as the word comes into the English language, the original economic meaning of it sort of falls away, and it comes to stand for the special skills or abilities that we have as individuals that we can use in either a good way or a bad way, that we should be rewarded for or punished for, but the original meaning of the term, which was economic, is gone now. You hear the word talent, you don't immediately start thinking about money, you start thinking about what we take the word literally to mean. Okay. So, having observed that, I go back and look at this essay of Eliot's, and I'm starting to look for sort of buried economic metaphors in this argument, which I start to discover. Which leads me to what Eliot himself would have known about economics, given what we can sort of infer from his education and other things he's written, so on and so forth. And I discover that and he had some pretty well-formed ideas about economics and politics and so on, that the sort of source for his ideas, it comes out of sort of 18th century French economic thought, which is sort of the dawn of economics as a science. This is when people first started trying to treat it as a sort of special subject of inquiry, in a group of guys who were called the physiocrats. One of them was a doctor. He was the attendant physician to Louis XV, as I recall, and the doctor developed a theory of economics that was based on his understanding of how the human body worked. So now I'm going back to the Eliot essay, and I'm looking for the bodily metaphors. Okay? Metaphors having to do with an understanding of the body, and to connect them to the economic metaphors, and to see if I can draw out of this sort of subtext, right? He's not explicitly giving you a theory of the body or explicitly giving you a theory of economics. He's talking about his theory of poetry. See if I can draw out of that, nevertheless, theories about the way the body works, theories about the way an economy works, and see if I can bring those to bear on my understanding of how Eliot's poetry, how he understands poetry. Okay. So I do all that. And I come up with something that I think is kind of a novel interpretation of what how T.S. Eliot understands poetry and literature. Okay, but that's not enough, or that's not enough if you're taking the approach that I tend to take or recommend that one takes. That is to say that you don't want to stop at the object itself and say, oh, okay, well, I've managed to make this familiar object strange, got my 25 pages or whatever it is that one needs, for a seminar or something like this, I'll stop right there. Instead, what I want to do is to see if I can take this now sort of newly estranged object, this essay by T.S. Eliot, and use it to look at the history of ideas that I've been drawing upon all along, the historical context in which he's operating, and say, okay, well, can I take this and now think about economics as a science as it has developed and as it is represented by, for example, friends of Eliot's, like Maynard Keynes, maybe the most important economist of the 20th century, Eliot's pal. Can I take T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry and sort of turn it back on the theory of economics, the history of the theory of economics? Can I take T.S. Eliot's theory of poetry and turn it back to look at the history of theories of the body that lead up to people like Freud, say, contemporary T.S. Eliot? And can I make those things strange too? Okay, can I come to some kind of understanding of ideas that are familiar, that are sort of received ideas, you might say, and by using this strange object as the lens through which to look at these familiar ideas in turn, make those strange, make me see them in a way I wouldn't have seen them otherwise, to understand them in a way that I wouldn't have understood them otherwise. And this, I think, it actually speaks to what David was saying earlier, with very, very true statement, that you hang around with humanists long enough, you find that it's talking about the same thing. My goodness, how many conversations about T.S. Eliot can a person have, right? And that's actually kind of a new topic, right? I mean, he's only been dead 45 years, right? How many conversations can a group of people have about Shakespeare? Right? It's a conversation that goes on and on and on and on. It might seem like a pointless conversation, but it might not. And one way in which it might not be pointless is that part of, I think, what our job as interpreters of artifacts is, part of what our job as humanists is to remember. Sort of a big part of what we do is just remembering. Okay? And a big part of remembering is taking the things that you find and sort of reviving them. Right? That if you just let that essay sit there as a received idea, right, eventually the monument would truly wither into dust, and we would forget that it had ever been there. You've got to find some way to take this bit of cultural material and to translate it into terms that we can understand now, to see it from perspectives that might not have been available even 10 years ago, say, to revive the object by sort of reinterpreting it. I think that's one reason why we do this kind of thing. But another reason why we do this kind of thing is, as I said, I, to my mind, want to stick with just the object itself, but to use the object as a way of kind of branching out to look at other things. And that's one of the values, I think, of going through the, at times, extraordinarily difficult act of interpreting something, really reading something closely. Is it because it enables you to have perspectives on other ideas, on historical events, on the context in which, the historical context in which you live, or the historical context which is still sort of affecting your present, to see that in a way that you would not have seen had you not taken the effort to make this familiar thing strange. And that provides not only a different perspective, a different kind of understanding, but a different possibility for action as well. So to try to move this in the direction of Writ 1133 just a little bit, I don't want to suggest that this is what we should talk about necessarily as a group, but just so that we make that transition. It seems to me that something that people who are doing this kind of reading, it doesn't have to be literary analysis, rhetorical analysis would do, I think, just as well, have a hard time with is to do what I've just described here, to try to make sense of something by finding what's odd about it. I think it's often sort of a counterintuitive, it seems like a counterintuitive thing to do, right? You read the poem, you read the speech, you read the article from the newspaper, you understand it perfectly well, right? So why do I need to go to the trouble of importing this odd vocabulary from dead languages is on, plopping it down on top of this text, which I understand perfectly well, what do I get out of that? Right? It seems like I've already gotten from it what I wanted from it. Why this additional sort of surplus move? I think what that vocabulary allows you to do is to create the kind of perspective that I was talking about a moment ago, that it allows you to see what's familiar in ways that you wouldn't see if you didn't apply the vocabulary. What the vocabulary does is to enable you to sort of pick out, describe, and give names to the sort of patterns that enable us to make sense of things in the first place, right? So when you're sort of reading the poem, or you're reading the article in the newspaper, or you're listening to Barack Obama give a speech or something like that, you might not think that you're interpreting that, right? You're just hearing it, or you're just reading the words that are on the page, and that information is going from those printed or spoken words directly into your head, and that there's no sort of intervening step. You just understand it because you perceive it. That's because we're used to applying certain ways of interpreting because we've grown up with them, we've learned them by osmosis or what have you. We don't feel that we're doing it. But we're doing it nevertheless. So what developing a vocabulary, kind of critical or interpretive vocabulary, I think enables you to do, is to stop and think about the processes whereby you interpret these things, but also to look for those deviations from those patterns. That, yeah, maybe you thought you understood the Scarlet Letter when you read it. It seemed like a story about unrequited love and it ended unhappily. You can sort of take it very literally like that, right? Or you can start to look for those things that don't just fit within that pattern, right? And to try to figure out, you could say, oh, I'm just going to dismiss that, and that's just an error on the author's part, or a little extra bit of ornamentation or flair or something like that. It's not really essential to the meaning, sort of accidental to it. Or you can, if you kind of have the right conceptual apparatus in place, begin to think about how you can take account of those things that you might otherwise overlook and begin to develop levels of understanding or more complex forms of understanding than you would have otherwise. So I'll leave it at that. I'll hand it back to David, I suppose.
That was actually beautiful. Well, thank you. In a little bit, we're going to do a Q&A. Chemists hate when accidents happen because things explode and blow up. Happen. But I'm going to come full circle in a less beautiful way here. I'm imagining your metaphor of the object down here, and I'm picturing T.S. Eliot way down there. T.S. Eliot had real issues about masculinity, about being way down there. Evidence of this is in Ezra Pound's diaries about T.S. Eliot. So there is a circular sort of accidental structure here, which the humanist loves. There's a connection between tiny Eliot at the bottom of all of this research. Take a minute, please, here to absorb, reflect. I'll invite our three panelists up here, and hopefully can generate some questions from you. So this is a very writerly movement. The teacher music. Reflect for just a minute or so, and then we'll do a Q&A. Okay, so I'll have our faculty come up here. Are there questions from the audience, things you want clarified? Doug seems to have a question.
I have a question about when you're writing, at what point do you start thinking about your readers and audiences? In both Luke's and Annette's talks, I could imagine popular audiences as well as academic audiences, and I think how you were writing would probably really shift for those. For John, it seemed like more of an academic audience that to start with would even be interested in complicating Eliot. So the question is, at what point and how do you start thinking of audience?
I start thinking about audience as soon as I start thinking about writing at all. It's essential from the beginning. And I'm especially interested in art as it touches everyday people. So there's been a lot of discussion about what's fine art, what's popular art, sort of this high, low, what are the areas in between. My work often is referred to by people who are very clearly in their own minds writing about fine art as popular art, right? Gravestones aren't by great famous artists very often, though there actually are lots and lots of gravestones by great famous artists. So because I work on popular culture and how it touches everyday lives, I do tend to write in a language that I think is accessible for everyday people. I want them to be able to understand what I'm saying. And I find it fascinating, so somehow I believe everybody else in the world.
I probably am quite similar. I think about the audience. Actually, the moment I start writing, I'm thinking about the audience, especially on my topic. The Russian scholarly community, either in the West or in Russia, is quite conservative. And I know quite well that I'm writing something that has caused sometimes at conferences, when I read sections of the book as conference papers, people to storm out of the room. So I'm thinking quite clearly of them, but not to convert them at all, but rather I'm thinking of them as my audience, but I'm targeting my writing actually more popularly in the hopes that enough people will get the it's a so strange mystical thing. I've done too much Russian in my life. It's this idea that it would get the conversation going, and then the crusty academics would start gearing up to it. So the moment I've put my fingers to the keyboard, I'm thinking about the audience.
I wouldn't say it happens at the moment my fingers hit the keyboard. I don't think that, because what I just described in a kind of a truncated way, there's a lot of wandering in the wilderness and not knowing if in fact you're going to find anything that anybody but you would think was interesting. You know, you really have to kind of trust that there's something at the end of it, but you don't really know what it is. And sometimes there isn't anything there. And so initially I'm just trying to make sense of something for myself. And I guess there are two ways in which I start to think about audience. One thought has to do with the audience for the writing. The other thought has to do with the audience for the speaking, because much of what I'm writing about will find its way into classes that I teach. And so I'm thinking about, well, who is the audience for this as a piece of writing? I'm thinking about it invariably, in very academic terms. I'm not imagining really that it's going to fall outside of those boundaries, in large part because it just always seems to me that there would be too much exposition involved in order to be able to get to what I actually want to talk about. And so that I'm looking for in that case, I'm looking at an audience for the written piece that I think is likely to have enough of that sort of background knowledge that I can sort of proceed with what I want to talk about. And then I'm thinking, well, am I writing here for literary theorists, i.e. people who are almost like philosophers and put in literature departments? Am I writing for a particular set of literary historians, people who know about this period? Am I writing to people who work on this genre? But these are all academic distinctions. Where it becomes a question of an audience that's not purely academic. It's when I'm standing someplace like this and trying to communicate it to people who aren't doing this kind of stuff professionally for a living. And that I often find what's really interesting about that is that because it forces you to do all the things I'm trying to avoid by just saying, well, I'm going to make these sort of assumptions about my audience and expect them to do this kind of work for me in their head, which at least pretend that they're doing it. That in the course of having to make an argument for a very, very different kind of audience like that, I really have to rethink the argument and discover all kinds of things about it that I wouldn't have discovered if I were writing to what amounts to an audience kind of like me, right? An audience that kind of thinks like me and has my knowledge base. When I'm speaking to a group of people who I don't make that assumption about, then all of the crutches that are in place when I'm writing something down on paper are no longer there. So your naked voice stands before the room and you're either making sense or you're not. But that's often where you find the parts of what you're arguing that actually don't make sense on the merits. And sort of forcing yourself to speak to a counterintuitive audience like that, I find always ultimately strengthens the argument, regardless of the context that it appears in next. Plus, I can talk with my hands. Teresa?
Obviously, your artifact itself is your primary source, but when you begin to look at your secondary sources, how important or valuable do you find it to critically approach your secondary sources and just really look at it from different angles?
The secondary sources are also important, and for me, especially creative context. So with the art object, it might never have been written about before, so I might not have secondary sources on that particular object, but certainly there's a context for it that has been written about a lot that may be what's the community surrounding it, or it may have to do with the meanings that one automatically associates with it. Going back to the example of the baby in a seashell, as I studied that, I found that that image was found on the graves of Protestants and Catholics and Jews, and that there were different meanings associated. So as I read about those contexts, those religious contexts, I came to understand that a single symbol was being understood and interpreted in very different ways within each of those communities. So the secondary is also very important.
I guess in my case, actually, what I would do with secondary sources, I have very few. When I was thinking about that, John was talking about the audience. There isn't really, what I'm doing hasn't really been talked about, so I'm sort of doing it blind. And the secondary sources, there are some that are published in the United States, and they're academic, and they're quite critical already, so I approach them that way. The Russian ones are publicistic, and they're useful to me, but they promote a certain political, philosophical, and religious position. And they're couched as academic sources, and I have to be quite careful when I use those, because they're driving home an agenda often blatantly for the government to me, although my Russian friends, I talk to them about them, think, oh yeah, these are great, they're not really things I should consider. So it gets very risky once I start getting into Russian territory specifically, because it's unusual.
Yeah, I was just going to say, I feel like I have such a vexed and maybe a sort of double relationship with secondary sources, which is that on the one hand, I'm extremely reliant on them. In that, again, if you're trying to interpret a poem or something like this, you can only sort of go with what's there. If it so happens that T.S. Eliot has an extensive knowledge of French economics, I don't have an extensive knowledge of French economics. But in order to understand this thing, I'm going to have to get myself up to speed. Right? So on the one hand, I'm kind of reliant on the authority of folks who can do that. And a little bit nervously reliant because I don't have the sort of expertise that can allow me to say definitively one way or another whether or not this apparently authoritative bit of secondary writing is in fact that. So you try to deploy kind of generic tools that you pick up in a class like Grid 1133, for example, about just sort of assessing the arguments in general. You know, does there appear that the writer is deriving their claims from their evidence, or do they appear to be sort of making stuff up? But when you get down to a fine-grained level of expertise, a bit at sea, and kind of reliant on the authority of the discipline itself, I'm drawn from. But the other thing that happens sometimes, and I bet this happens also with what you were just describing about getting these publicistic pieces, sometimes what appears to be a secondary source becomes one of your primary objects of investigation. Right? So you're looking at this listing material, thinking it will help you to flesh out the context a little bit about the thing you're really interested in, and then suddenly you go, wow, that's actually really interesting itself. And that's what sometimes happens. You find yourself wandering to a text that you think is just going to inform what you're saying about the text with which you started. And then you become intrigued by that text in its own right. And it's sort of promoted from secondary to primary. It's especially true, I find, with things that are historical in nature.
And I wanted to comment too, because it kind of reminds me of Mona Lisa. When I was in grad school, I was writing on Heart of Darkness, Joseph Conrad, very famous novel. But I wanted to do a kind of provocative, queer reading of the novel. So what I went to first was the stacks and stacks of secondary sources on this novel, until my professor, bless Susan Gubar, said, no, don't read any of the background secondary sources, just write your argument first. And I was like, oh, this is great. This will never happen in 1133, because the clincher is this. Then when I wrote my argument, she said, good, now go back and read all the secondary sources. And the purpose there was so that I could at least speak first and then negotiate with the secondary sources, because she found me really bogged down with other people's ideas. And that's a balancing act. And in 1133, you've got to do it in a couple of weeks, and we're sensitive to that. There's time for revision, but it's a negotiation between secondary and primary sources, so it's tough. Other questions?
I have one.
No, go ahead.
Jeff and then Teresa.
Wait, Luke, you mentioned that finding this other book about what you're going to do, and it turned out okay. And looking at cemeteries, I was wondering if what level collaboration plays, or working with other scholars. Are there other people that write about cemeteries that you work with, or is that antagonistic, or can it be positive? Have you had any experience with that?
That's a really good question. Much of my work, especially the research phase of it, is very isolated, very individual, and partly because I'm choosing to work on things that haven't been written about much. On the other hand, there are a lot of other people like me who are also interested in gravestones as an art form generally, so there is an association of gravestone studies.
Of course.
Are there any living members?
So there are lots of us, and we get to talk to each other then about our particular area, and of course all knowledge overlaps. Everything overlaps, everything connects. So you can't start out and you can start in isolation, you can't end there. You're going to end up contributing to a bigger conversation.
And in the book that I referred to, that taught me that, took me back, because it's already on the same topic, sort of. That person who wrote the book was at a conference at the University of Southern California. A bunch of people were flown in from around the world to talk about topics similar to this. And I read a paper which is published in Russia in a volume there, and it's going to be part of this book because it fits perfectly. And he after I read the paper and I mentioned this, he was actually one of the people who came up to me and said, this can't be published in Russia today because everyone will go haywire. You can't talk about this stuff. We aren't ready. This happens to me all the time, it seems, so it must be a warning that I should stop now. But that's one reason why he approached his book so differently. And since then, I've kept regular contact with him and have seen him, and he has encouraged me and pushed me in certain directions. So his own experience, which is based entirely in Russia from the Soviet period to today, has been very helpful. And his book has been a way to shape mine as an answer, in a sense.
No, I suppose we say ditto, really. There's a way in which interacting with other people is the only way to keep that thought alive. It does. It's a solitary nature to it. Sort of a lot of this kind of work is the kind of work that you can only do alone. But then there aren't necessarily that many other people who think about what you're thinking about as deeply as you think about it. Right? There may be only one person in the class who's that obsessed with hairspray. But you need to find other hairspray addicts or other people in the class who are interested in similar issues to keep those wheels turning, because that's not energy that you can create out of nothing yourself, time and time and time.
And this is an issue I want my students at least to think about later in the quarter, because we'll get to these quantitative papers, and you'll see a string of authors' names, sort of like a hip-hop song, just featuring this, featuring that, featuring that. So we'll talk about this nature of collaboration and how this differs quite a bit across the disciplines. Teresa, did you have a question?
Yeah, but I don't know. We'll try it anyway. I feel that, you know, in so many things that you research, you're going to find a pattern, and you had mentioned briefly that you do use partially quantitative methods. So do you think that's something you see often when you're doing your research in an interpretive way, that you apply quantitative?
Yeah, I think you often do go back and forth between lots of different methods. In fact, I find it hard to do anything with a single method. There's lots of different places where it seems like if you just bring in this or that, borrow from other fields, other disciplines, there are lots of things that can help you better understand what you're looking at. Just gives you a broader perspective, see it from different views.
Other questions?